Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library, and today we're going to be discussing some basic computer shopping. If you are planning to learn on how to build your own computer, this is not the video for you, but we might discuss that in a future video. So before you buy your new computer, there's some honest questions you need to ask yourself. The first one being what you actually plan on using the computer for. If you're just going to be using it for your basic email, web browsing, and word processing needs, then you probably don't need the latest and greatest. You will, however, if you plan on playing the latest video games or doing a lot of high-level computer-aided design or video editing. At the same time, even if you are just a basic user but plan on storing lots of movies and pictures of family, you're going to want to keep that in mind as you'll fill up storage a lot faster than you'd think. Next question is, where do you plan on using this computer? Is it just going to be at a desk where you can afford to take up a bit more space? Is this going to be something you're using on a couch while you're watching television? Does your computer need to be mobile? And that doesn't just mean, putting it in a laptop bag and carrying it around the United States as you fly all over. Even just going back and forth from a desk to a bedroom to a living room, you're going to want something more mobile if that's the case. Next question, what is your price range? If you're looking to just get something basic but up to date, you're going to be spending $500. If anything is much less than that, there's probably a reason. If you plan on building your own workstation for something graphics intensive, you're going to be looking at spending several $1,000s easy. Next question, how long do you expect to use it? I know most people probably would expect to use their device until they don't want to anymore, but there are circumstances where you need something to just use as a stopgap until you plan on getting something more robust, or maybe you're going to use something and then pass it down to a younger family member. There are situations where you, again, might need something for, up to a year. And one final question, out of many more that I'm sure will come to mind, is what is the next generation of technology and when is it coming out? So you don't need to become an expert on Intel's corporate roadmap, but it helps to, put your ear to the ground and find out if the next wave of stuff is coming out imminently, because when it does, you'll either get something a lot more productive for your money, or you can settle for something a little older and the price will most likely drop. So I plan on looking at some off-the-shelf PC specs a little bit later. However, there's a lot of computer shopping questions where an off-the-shelf PC isn't necessarily the best answer, and I'd like to cover some of those answers right now. So if you're looking for the cheapest option for basic computer use, the answer is almost always going to be a Chromebook, which will run you about $150. Now those will run on Google's Chrome OS, which is basically like a glorified Android phone with a keyboard. You're going to have very limited specs, meaning not much processing power, not much RAM, not much storage for videos, applications, pictures. And you're going to be very cloud dependent, which means in order to connect to all the Google services to use your Chromebook, you're going to need an internet connection. So if all that sounds fine to you, then Chromebook is probably a good way to go. Another solution that will help you on the cheap, especially if it's just for a limited period of time, would be a refurbished PC, which will probably go for about the same thing. So these tend to be older, basic computers that were used in offices, and probably the kind of computers we use at the library as well, which tend to be Dells, Lenovo's, or HP small form factor computers. So at the same time, if you just need to check in with the computer every now and then, you can always visit the library as well, which is paid for by your taxes. If you're looking for the best overall experience and money is no object, I would probably point you at Apple products. And again, you're going to pay a premium for that experience. So the hardware and software tend to feel good, prove reliable, and it might have a little bit of an adjustment period if you're coming from Windows, but otherwise we've got some old MacBooks floating around the library that have been around for at least 10 years, and they still run extremely well. They're very good feeling, very well put together machines. On top of that, their customer service tends to be the best that I've seen. And I've worked with Dell and HP in particular, and I will say even with a organization level warranty, the service has been going down. If you're looking to be doing stuff with high-end graphics, again, video gaming, video editing, computer-aided design, then you're going to be looking at probably building your own PC or buying something that is pre-built for you with premium parts, and it'll probably run you over $2,000. Again, the latest and greatest video cards are running well over $1,000 by themselves. You throw in a CPU, a bunch of RAM, etc., and you're going to be spending quite a pretty penny. But you'll probably still get more bang for your buck versus buying a high-end Apple product. Plus, they're just easier to maintain and upgrade piece by piece. That's one of the draws of building your own computer, is if you get yourself a nice big tower, build it with the basics. As money becomes more available or as later technology comes out, you can upgrade it, and in the long run, it'll save you a whole bunch of money. If you're in the market for a computer, you probably have something in mind. However, as we go over the different types of computers that a consumer will usually look at, you might realize something else better suits your use case. For example, I had a woman in a Windows 11 class who was looking to upgrade to a Windows 11 laptop from a Windows 10 laptop, and then did a little bit of thinking and research and realized that a tablet would actually better suit her use case. You can always use a Bluetooth keyboard to do any word processing on a tablet if it comes to it. So you might have a similar realization as we have this discussion. We'll start off with the desktops, and a desktop computer is meant to sit on top of your desk, as the name implies, although a lot of people will put them below their desk if it's a little bit bigger, just to save space. These are generally the best choice if you're doing a lot of processor-intensive tasks. So a bigger computer is going to have more room for more parts, bigger parts, have more upgrading paths, and it's also going to have better airflow, which is important for keeping your processors running at peak performance for as long as possible. The baseline price of a standard desktop is about $500, and that's in 2023. Of course, you'll see prices a lot lower, and in that case, it's usually an older model or something refurbished. You'll also see prices way higher, and that will usually be computers that include a larger graphics card, which can run over $1,000 by itself. So the well-known brands are HP, Dell, Lenovo, and Acer, and they've mostly built in their names in the corporate world. So pretty much everywhere I've worked, it's been HP and Dell all the way. Other brands you might see will fall into the pre-built category, so where Dell or HP will use their own parts or generic parts and make everything specifically a certain way to minimize their footprint and power usage, and usually there's minimal expandability. You'll see pre-builts like iBuyPower, CyberPower, Origin, and a whole bunch of other brands that come and go that will actually use branded parts all the way across the board. So your power supply, your RAM, your motherboard will all be name brand, and they'll be better quality, more expandability, better performance just in general. You can also build your own computer, which is basically what the pre-built category is for. It's just they do it for you for usually about a $100 or $200 upcharge. So the desktop computers come in many form factors. They have many names. I'm not sure if anything's formalized, but I'm going to call them mini PCs, small form factor PCs, and towers. There's a whole bunch of other kinds of form factors. I've seen computers built inside little miniature trains that go back and forth on a track with a smokestack. Company called Leon Lee was actually building computers inside of desks with glass tops. It's really cool, but extremely expensive. The bigger the form factor, again, the more potential for performance and expandability. So For a desktop computer, just in general, upgrading, troubleshooting, replacing parts, and adding parts is much easier. And having worked with computers at work and at home, I will definitely vouch for that. The bigger the computer is, the easier it is to get in there, and the more likely you're going to be able to find parts to swap in and out. Usually the smaller computers will have very proprietary builds where it's hard to find the right part without going directly through a warranty. Another note about desktops is they'll usually come with a basic keyboard and mouse, and that's it. So when you're shopping for computers, they don't typically come with a monitor or speakers or a webcam or a mic. So that's something to keep in mind and to add into the cost if you're buying something from scratch. On the other hand, if you have a monitor or even a small TV with an HDMI input, you can get away without buying all the parts at once. And here's just an example of a mini PC, a small form factor PC, and a mid tower. And in our lab, you'll see all the small form factor PCs, although they'll be laying flat with the monitor sitting on top of them. Of course, this is just a mid tower, so a full-size tower will be even much bigger for the room with like 8 or 9 different bays for hard drives and things like that. The next type of computer I'd like to discuss is a laptop, which, as the name implies, is meant to sit on your lap. Seriously, when the name first came to be, laptops were extremely heavy and ran extremely hot. In fact, I worked at a computer store where we sold all sorts of accessories dedicated to keep you from burning your legs. This included like padding and things with fans. Nonetheless, it's probably your best choice for mobility and all-inclusive functionality. And by that, I mean your typical laptop will come with a display and speakers, and usually a webcam and microphone as well. Whereas with a desktop, you're forced to buy all that extra. So there's no extra cost when you buy your laptop. You're just good to go once you got it. If you don't like what's included with your laptop, or maybe you needed to augment what's already there, you can also plug into various upgrades. For example, you can carry a small laptop around, and when you get home or to your office, you can plug into a much larger display to help you see better. Or maybe if you need better speakers, you can plug into some portable speakers or headphones. And in fact, just to do this video, I am using a better mic than what's included with the screen. So it's nice to have those options, but at the same time have everything already there in the single package. The laptop is perfect for word processing, web browsing, email, and basic streaming. And by that, I mean like Zoom meetings. I wouldn't do any video game streaming with the laptop. I would say the laptop is a bad choice in terms of processor-intensive workloads or excessive storage, since your laptop will typically have 2 hard drives at most. I say it's a bad choice because all of the various tasks that can burn up a processor are extremely draining on the battery, and it's extremely stressful on the internal parts because laptops typically don't have sufficient cooling. Even ones with water cooling are not going to be as good as you'll get with a desktop, and that'll affect the longevity. And again, with the battery life, I've seen high-end gaming laptops that have all the bells and whistles, but once you unplug from a power source, you have less than an hour of actual gaming on that battery. The laptop space is actually pretty big and growing. We have all the brands that we discussed earlier, as well as Asus, Razer, Toshiba, among many others, which is good for the consumer to offer options and keep prices low. A laptop will usually just be big enough to accommodate a display, and because of that, you might get smaller keys than you would like, or in the case of a lot of laptops, you won't get a number pad, which for a lot of tasks is extremely helpful. I like goofing around with Blender, and the number pad shortcuts are an extremely useful shortcut. So you can always plug in a number pad like you do a mouse with a USB port, but a laptop's ports are typically pretty limited as well. So you'd be getting like a USB hub to expand your number of ports, and then you're getting all sorts of accessories on top of that. So that's another drawback of the laptops, is your port availability and the need to carry all sorts of accessories around typically. So something to look for when you get a laptop is some will have a touch screen. And if you look at the Surface laptops, a lot of those will actually have screens that detach to be used as tablets. They tend to run a little bit more expensive, but nonetheless, if money isn't a huge factor, that is a really cool option. Something to keep in mind with laptops as well as desktops is when you're buying them and you might see the Windows 10 computers run a little bit cheaper because they're a little bit older. Keep in mind that Windows 10 reaches its end of life in 2025, and at that time you'll want to upgrade to keep up with security and updates, and not all computers are ready to make that transition. And in some cases there's things you can do to meet the requirements, in other cases you might be out of luck. So again, keep that in mind if you're trying to save a few dollars and buy a Windows 10 computer. You might have compatibility issues down the line. The last type of computer I'd like to talk about is the tablet. Tablets typically run on Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Android. You might notice that Microsoft runs the same operating system on tablets and desktops where Google and Apple do not. And that's been a part of the Microsoft dream ever since Windows 8. It's to get the same computing experience across all devices, have them be able to sync, not even included phones at one time. I personally think that's kind of hurt the desktop functionality, but I don't see that changing anytime soon. If you were wondering what the difference was between a phone and a tablet, the difference is usually a tablet does not have a modem or a broadband plan attached to it, but you can certainly do that. Otherwise, they run the same operating systems and function pretty much the same way. And even if your tablet doesn't have a modem, you can still get it to sync with a smartphone if they're running the same operating system. In other words, I have an iPhone that syncs with an iPad. So you can get your tablet to function pretty much just like a laptop as long as you have a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse. The only difference is you're going to be limited to apps, but there's certainly apps for browsing the internet, checking email, and doing office tasks. One of the problems with tablets is there's almost no expandability or upgradability. You're pretty much stuck with what you buy. Sure, some phones have the ability to throw in a micro SD card to get a little bit more memory, but that's about it. You're also going to be limited to the applications on the App Store. So with most desktops, you might be accustomed to going to websites and downloading installations. On tablets, that's typically not how you do things. They're a little bit more locked down for security reasons and maybe to milk a little bit more money out of their stores. On kind of a related note, when you go shopping for computers, you'll see some computers have Windows in S mode as their operating system, whether it's Windows 10 or Windows 11. And that is also trying to restrict you to the store in terms of downloading apps, as well as restricting your browsing to Edge. And they say it's a security feature, which perhaps it is, but it's also probably a way to try to guide you to their store. And in case that's a deterrent, you can get out of S mode, but you can never go back in. So it's a pretty simple procedure, and after you do that, you'll be able to browse with Chrome and download stuff from websites. So, kind of in summation, I would say the tablet is more portable than a laptop with just a little less functionality, and that's changing more and more as more and more apps come out and as the performance improves. In this part of the video, I would like to have a look at some of the common components that make up your standard desktop PC, so we know what we're looking at when we go shopping. I'm going to be kind of quick and brief and not go into any more detail than we really need to, just to keep this video from running too long. So the first item on the list is the case, and that's what you look at when you are shopping for a desktop PC, and it's the box that holds all the components, keeps them locked down, keeps them protected from the elements, and hopefully keeps them cool with ample fans and ventilation. So often nowadays you see cases where there's some fans in the front, but then tempered glass in front of it, which just makes absolutely no sense. Other than that, you want to make sure that there's enough ports for your peripherals, so ideally at least 4 USB ports, perhaps more, and a USB port if that's something that you intend to use. The next item is the motherboard, which basically connects all the components, and it's not something you really look at too much when you're actually shopping for a PC, but something to keep in mind if you're planning on trying to upgrade your RAM, that not all RAM is compatible with all motherboards. So it's just something to be aware of, but otherwise something you don't really look at while you're shopping. Next item on the list is the CPU. I think everyone's at least heard of that. I've heard some people call computers CPUs, which is not quite right. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and I think a lot of people have heard that the CPU is the brain of the computer. That's a pretty common analogy. So it basically is what determines how fast your computer runs and how much it can do at one time. The big manufacturers are AMD and Intel. So when you're shopping for computers, a lot of times that's the first thing you'll see. It'll say AMD whatever computer with such and such processor, so much RAM, whatever. AMD and Intel are pretty much at parity with each other right now in terms of price and performance. So that's good for the consumer. When you're looking at CPUs, you're generally looking at speed, cores, threads, and what generation it is. Just whether or not it's an older or newer CPU. Generally speaking, the speed is kind of hard to gauge. They'll give you like a base speed and a turbo speed. You just want to make sure it's over 3, and even then that's kind of arbitrary. What I would look for more than anything else is cores and threads, and you generally want to see at least 4 cores. They call threads logical cores, but in actuality they're sharing resources on a core, so you'll see like 4 cores, 8 threads. It's not the same as 8 cores. So I would generally look for 4 physical cores. As far as generation goes, the newer the generation, the more power efficient, the better performance, etc. you're going to see out of a CPU. Otherwise, I generally don't worry about that too much. And it's hard to really compare speeds between generations and between brands. So what I would recommend doing if you really, really care is you can go on YouTube and you'll find people that do benchmarks with CPUs and GPUs across brands and across generations, so you can get a feel for how good a CPU or GPU is versus another, see if it's actually worth upgrading. What's kind of nice about the CPU industry right now is Intel and AMD have made branding kind of easy to understand. So you've got your Intel Core i3 and your AMD Ryzen 3 at your basic level. The i5 and i7, along with the Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7, are considered mid-level. And the Core i9 and the Ryzen 9 are considered high-end. And I think there's some more levels above that, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So generally speaking, you're looking at the i5 and the i7 to get your 4 cores and however many threads. The i7s and the Ryzen 7s probably have 8 cores and 16 threads. So I would look in this area and try to catch a deal. At the basic level, you're generally looking at dual core 2 threads or dual core 4 threads, which might not be enough to do multiple tasks at once. Next up is the RAM, or the random access memory, which the analogy is that this is the short-term memory of your computer, where the hard drive or hard drives are the long-term memory of the computer. So the RAM will hold the data that the CPU is actively using, and if the CPU cannot find what it's looking for in RAM, it needs to fetch it from your hard drive and then swap what it needs from the hard drive with the RAM. And so it's this fetching and swapping that will stop your computer when it needs to load, or if a computer starts to stall. It's usually this RAM and hard drive swapping that's stalling and holding things up. So the more RAM you have, the more likely the CPU will find what it's looking for, and the less often you need to do this swapping memory back and forth between your RAM and your hard drive. So Windows 11 says it needs 4 gigabytes, but I've been recommending 8 gigabytes for the longest time now, and I'm not going to stop doing that. So next up is the hard drive, or the HDD. And again, this is main storage or the long-term memory of your computer, and it's what determines how many files and applications and movies and whatever that you can store on your computer. You're starting to see a lot of acronyms in place of the HDD, and one of those is SSD, which stands for Solid State Drive. So where your standard hard drive disk has rotating platters and readers and lots of mechanical parts, a solid state drive does not. It basically works more like a flash drive, so it's just electricity. So it is much faster, but also tends to hold less memory and run a bit more pricier. But it's the difference between booting in a couple minutes or booting in a couple of seconds. And I will say, as someone that works on a lot of computers, this has been an absolute game changer in my regular responsibilities. So an acronym that I've seen recently is PCIe NVMe M.2 SSD, down here on the second to last line. And that's basically just the latest and greatest type of solid state drive. Basically looks like a stick of RAM, except it plugs into the motherboard on the short end, and you usually got to screw the other end in. So it's kind of neat installing it, and again, it's just a bit more faster, usually a bit less capacity, and definitely a bit more expensive than what came before it, but it is the next stage, and it's what we're starting to see more and more on the latest computers. And Windows 11 says it needs at least 64 gigabytes of hard drive to work with, but I have seen it several times where people have run out of space to do their updates, so I recommend doing more than the bare minimum here. So I think the next step up you usually see is 128. The last component I want to talk about, and I don't want to get too deep into it, is the GPU, or a graphics processing unit. And this is basically a second processor that takes the graphics processing load off of the CPU. So the name brands you'll see are AMD, NVIDIA, and Intel. The lower end of the GPUs will be integrated either inside the CPU itself or soldered onto the motherboard, and that's typically going to be your Intel integrated graphics. It's usually like 3,000, 4,000, something like that. The high-end GPUs will be discrete or separate from the motherboard. They'll have their own daughter board typically, and they'll plug into a PCI Express 16 slot, which is usually one of the big ones at the bottom of the motherboard. So these GPUs are pretty small, just like a CPU, just a little square or rectangle of silver-looking metal. But the high-end GPUs will require all sorts of cooling, which is why you see these graphic cards that they're put on that usually run about a foot long and have a couple pounds of metal on them for cooling and several fans, and it'll probably take up 2 or 3 expansion slots. They can be quite large, and they can draw literally hundreds of watts of power, and on the high end they tend to go well over $1,000 as well. So in terms of performance, it's really hard to gauge. Again, there's lots of people on the internet that have done benchmarking between generations and brands. I'd recommend having a look there if you're curious as to how strong your GPU is and whether or not it's something you might want to upgrade. So next I thought I'd discuss some monitor basics, seeing as the standard desktop PC doesn't typically come with a monitor. My best advice for purchasing a monitor would be to actually go see it in person before you purchase it. Because despite whatever specs and reviews you see online, it really doesn't hold a candle to what your eyes say. And if you do see a couple monitors with similar specs online, if you go see them in person, you're almost certainly going to have a preference. If you can't do that, the next best thing would be to go to a website where they actually test and review monitors so you can see how your monitor stacks up against its competition. And they'll also say things that specs don't with regards to color accuracy, backlight bleeding around the edges, and things like that. If you run into a issue with your monitor or it dies on you and you're in a pinch, don't forget you can usually use your television as a monitor. A TV is basically a monitor with a TV tuner. As long as the inputs and outputs match, and you're usually okay with just a standard HDMI cable. When you're actually buying your monitor, the first thing I would look at is the size. Make sure it fits in the area that it needs to go in, and make sure it's big enough to suit your tastes. The standard tends to be 24 inches or thereabouts. For comparison, our lab has monitors that are about 21.5 inches, which doesn't seem small until you compare it with other monitors. I never really think about it, honestly. After size, the next thing to look at is resolution, and that's how many pixels are on the screen at once. Honestly, a higher resolution will look better, but don't forget that's that many more pixels that your computer has to process. And the higher it gets, the more stress on your processing it's going to be. So I've got the list of acronyms here and what they mean. HD is high def, and that's 720p, and that's standard television broadcasting. FHD is 1080p, and that's what your standard display resolution usually is. And that's what I recommend for most people running a standard desktop PC. After that comes QHD, or quad high def, and that's at 1440p, and that's what a lot of high-end gamers will stick to, because a full 4K is a lot more stress on your processor, and they want to use that processing power for their frame rate instead of their resolution. Quite frankly, most standard displays aren't really big enough to take full advantage of this anyway. People have trouble telling the difference until you start getting into like 40 and 50 inch televisions. And after QHD, you have the 4K and the 8K, which again are just overkill for the video sources that are available and for the processing power of most computers. So after that, we have the refresh rate, which is just how many frames per second your computer is producing. 60 is the standard. Most people can't see a difference after 120. And by most people, I mean unless you are a teenager on caffeine who plays video games professionally. So another point of interest is when you're producing twice the frames, going from 60 to 120. Again, that's twice as much graphics processing on your GPU. So it's okay if your computer has trouble reaching your monitor's potential. Most monitors have built-in programs to help balance frame rates out so it doesn't get too stuttery or jumpy. After that comes response time, and this is an example of a mushy number that every company seems to have its own way of measuring. They tend to list something between 5 and 10 seconds. Anything lower than that, and the monitor is probably overclocking or trying to predict where your motion is going, so you'll get blurring in front of motion instead of behind it. On the flip side, if your response time can't keep up with the refresh rate, you're going to get blurring and ghosting behind the motion. So again, it's a mushy thing, and it's something you can only really trust your eyes to, or maybe professionals doing testing. Brightness is measured in nits. 250 seems to be the standard, and it's probably fine, but anything lower than that, and you'll have trouble raising the brightness to something that might be more accommodating if you have special needs. After that, I've got a list of all the monitor types here. You can stop the video and have a quick look at what they all mean. I generally recommend IPS for the color accuracy versus TN for the speed, or VA for its darks. Okay, so let's go shopping. I'm on BestBuy.com because why not? Quite frankly, as far as buying new computers go, there's so little room for margin that you're pretty much going to see the same prices everywhere you go. The only real variance you're going to see is in sales and open box and refurbished products. So we're going to buy a new computer based on the specs we discussed for a standard desktop PC. We go to computers and tablets, laptops and desktops, and then desktops and all-in-one computers. Now, I know I didn't discuss all-in-one computers too much, and quite frankly, I don't care for them. The reason for that is if your monitor dies, you lose your computer. If your computer dies, you also lose your monitor. You do save some space, but it's space that I don't really care to lose because I put my desktop on the floor. And there's very little room for your components, which means your specs are usually not going to be topped out, and there's no room for expansion or upgrade. So there's no advantage to me, and there's plenty of downside, at least from my perspective. So that is why I do not care for all-in-one computers. But for now, we are shopping for a desktop, so we'll click on all desktops. And on the left side here, we're going to set our filtering. So I said Intel Core i5 or AMD Ryzen 5 is about the bottom of where we want to be. That'll pretty much guarantee we get at least 4 cores. RAM, we said at least 8 gigabytes. So let's go ahead and choose a couple of these here. Up to 16. After 16 gigabytes, you're probably looking at a more expensive computer. I'm not going to even mark the price. We'll just see what comes up. Actually, let's see what we have right now, just going from low to high. Yeah. And sure enough, like I said before, if you're far beneath $500, there's probably a reason. This guy is refurbished, as is this guy, as is this guy, as is this guy. So basically, everything that's really cheap has also seen a bit of wear and tear. So we're going to go ahead and click the new condition here. Continuing to scroll down here. I am kind of partial to AMD. My first computer was an AMD, and I've kind of had some brand loyalty ever since. We'll leave it empty, though. Storage capacity, I think we want at least 500 gigabytes. And more than that, yeah, let's see what comes up. We're already priced low to high. And okay, we've got an HP, AMD, Ryzen 5. That sounds good. $550, so that's again around that $500 mark that I considered our baseline. I'm going to go ahead and click on it and see what it looks like here. It's fairly well reviewed. Yeah, it looks kind of plain. You can see some other images by rolling over here. Notice they do have a keyboard and mouse, which is pretty standard. And on every website, you usually got to scroll down below the pictures to get at the specs. So let's go ahead and click on that and see what we're dealing with. Oh, it's kind of nice that they rate everything for us here. So medium processor, which is about what we're looking for. Medium RAM. Entry-level Radeon graphics. That probably means it's integrated, which, again, for a standard PC experience, that's fine. SSD, storage type, they rate at average. Average capacity. So, yeah, it looks good. This processor model number, if you don't know what it means, you can put it into a Google search, but I happen to know that means that this is called an APU, where the graphics and the regular CPU are combined into one. And again, for our purposes, it's fine. Windows 11, that's good. We don't have to worry about updating issues. Released in 2022, so it's relatively modern. 6 cores, excellent. Storage type, it's an SSD, and it's the NVMe, which I mentioned is pretty quick. So this looks like a keeper. So anyway, I hope you learned something today. Thanks for shopping with me. Good luck, and have a good day.